Welcome to Family Talk from Care Visions, where we explore what's shaping childhood today and how families and communities can help children thrive. I'm Lucy Johnston, and my guest I'm honoured to say, is Mary Glasgow, Chief Executive of Children First, Scotland's national children's charity. Mary has spent over 30 years working with children and families, first as a social worker and now one of Scotland's leading voices on child wellbeing. She's warned that we're not just failing some children, we're failing childhood itself. Today, we'll look at what's happening for families across Scotland, from poverty, the legacy of lockdown, and the pressures of digital life, and how carers and communities can make a difference. Mary, thank you so much for joining us. You've said that childhood itself is under threat. What do you mean by that?
I mean exactly what it says. We've been focused on protecting children and their rights for over 100 years at Children First. And when we sat down this year to think about our next strategic plan, and we consulted with children, young people, caregivers, other policymakers, community members, and other people that care and are concerned about children, one of the things that came back that really alarmed us was this notion that we needed to focus our attention not only on protecting children, but as you rightly said, protecting the very notion of childhood itself. And when we dug deeper into that and we explored it directly with children and young people, they talked about living with a level of, knowledge, experience, and fear that we would never have associated with the notion of a happy childhood in a modern, progressive, wealthy country like Scotland. So we began to think about, are we walking into some sort of digital destruction of childhood, first of all? We've all seen babies and toddlers walking about with devices. We know that when children are online, they're exposed to extreme content that's harmful. We know through lockdown that many of our children and young people were isolated from nursery and from school and from their friends and from core child development processes that help us develop into healthy adults. And yet we seem to have forgotten some of the basics of child development. And so we find ourselves as a campaigning organisation and as well as a service delivery organisation on behalf of those babies and children and young people feeling that we need to fight for their right to childhood, a time that should be safe, that should be happy, where they're not frightened about poverty, they're not anxious about how their parents are, they're not worried about what they see online, they're not frightened about their futures, they feel unsafe in their relationships. And for us, that just felt like a really alarming wake-up call that we wanted to share. It's a bit depressing, it doesn't make us happy, but we felt like somebody needed to call this out on behalf of children because it's so vitally important.
How do we know that things are worse for children today? I mean, is there any way of measuring that? I know that there is a lot of anxiety and mental health sort of pandemic among children, but some people say, well, we're just picking it up and we're overblowing or overdiagnosing people.
We've asked children, we've asked adults, we've asked caregivers. So we've done some individual surveys where we've said, do you think childhood is better now or was it better when you were a child? And, shockingly, 85% of people came back and said to us, we think it's harder to be a child now than it was when we were younger. And I think part of that is what we expect children to navigate. What we expect very young children to cope with and understand in our very complex world is mind-blowing, really. I mean, little children are expected, we'll say things like, I was talking to colleagues earlier today, actually, and somebody said the phrase, we need to support children to keep themselves safe online. Now, we know when we speak to children, one of the overwhelming things that they say to us is, we can't keep ourselves safe. You're the grown-ups. We need you to take action to do that. And I think that comes through from children, from young people, but also those adults around them that love them. I think if you talk to teachers, community workers, youth workers, social workers, our own colleagues, the overwhelming thing that people tell us is that children are overwhelmed with the expectations. They're expected to manage their mobile phone and their digital lives as well as their real lives in school. They're expected to perform well and come out with great exams. They're coping in families who are also overwhelmed. They know much more, which is a good thing, about neurodivergence and some of the additional support needs that they might have. But that is a lot for children to carry. And it's a burden that we've given them that we need to take back off them, in my view.
Do you think the biggest pressures are technology, or you've also talked about poverty, and you've mentioned just there the sort of results-led system of our academia? What do you think the biggest pressures are on children today?
I think poverty has always been an issue. We've made some inroads over time. In and of itself, it's very, very harmful. It's devastating for children. So poverty has significant impacts on children's life chances, their development, their safety, their well-being, their ability to perform in school, their ability to be in safe relationships at home. It underpins everything. So that is the number one, I think, thing that we need to sort out. And we can do that. We need to make the choice to absolutely prioritise that no child in Scotland goes hungry. Every child has a fair and, equal start in life. That absolutely has to be a baseline. But it should be a baseline, not this unobtainable thing that we've made it. The second thing, I think, and this is based on the overwhelming evidence that we get from children and young people themselves, is what happens to them when they go onto the digital world, that they are not safe. The web is a place where our children go. We think that they're safe in their bedrooms, but it's robbing them of their childhoods. So we hear inevitably, because we're a child protection charity, we know, we check ourselves. We know that we deal with children who've had very difficult experiences. But when they come to us to describe something happening to them, if they've been the victim of abuse or violence, what they talk about is that particular incident. And then as we build a therapeutic, recovery-focused relationship with them, they then describe a whole history of online content which has desensitized them, scared them, harmed them, that makes their judgment and their boundaries about what's okay in real life really impacted. So the impact of having digital devices in your hand before you're able to understand what it means, with the expectation that you can navigate against very sophisticated people who intend to groom or cause harm online, places a burden on children that I think is really frightening for them. So I think it's there's no hierarchy of all the things that can go wrong for children. But I do think this digital world that we've created and this overwhelm that we feel about what to do about it feels like the genie's out the bottle. Nobody really wants to face up to it. Nobody really wants to talk about it because we've all put it in the too difficult to fix box for whatever reason, whether it's the power that the tech companies have, the reluctance that politicians have to talk about it, or a lack of solid research evidence that we can easily translate so that parents can understand it, or because we're all addicted. And when we try and control it, children say to us, well, you're a hypocrite because you're on your phone all the time too. Whatever it's about, it feels to me like those are the two big urgent things that we need to tackle. And make some really good decisions, because this thing is, it's running away from us very, very fast.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you said just now the genie's out of the bottle. Do you have any thoughts about what should or, could be done? There are campaigns, aren't there, to ban the use of smartphones in sort of under 18s, I think, or school children. Do you think that would be appropriate, or do you think that's impossible because you've got siblings, friends, and, as you say, genie's out of the bottle? Is there anything you think could be done, and what can carers do to sort of help provide a safety net in this current situation?
Yeah, I think it's so difficult, and it's so difficult for parents and caregivers. And we need, whatever we do, we need to do it without shaming or blaming. We need to do it alongside mums and dads and grandparents and people who love their children. We also need to do it with young people who've got a right and an entitlement to be able to access the information in the digital world, but they have a right to do that safely. I think it's incredibly complicated, but I do think there are things that we can do. So we've led Children First, we've led the campaign so that children can't be physically punished or smacked in Scotland. We've seen really progressive public health campaigns around smoking, around seatbelts. One of the things that we think we could do is really share in some very clever campaign messaging the reality of the harms that we think this does to children, whether that's their development. So whether or not it's okay for babies to be staring at screens for long periods, what does that do to their brain development? How do their eyes respond to that? How does it get in the way of the relationships that they need to develop with their caregivers through eye gaze and serve and return conversations? What does it do to have our children on digital devices in schools all day? And I think we need to share the information in a public health way, which is non-stigmatized, doesn't blame anybody, shares it in a fair, in a way that's not hysterical, but is honest and open about the risks as well as the advantages, and then co-produce a national conversation about what are we going to do about it and how do we respond to it in a way that keeps up with the same pace of development that is in the digital world. And so one of the things that we think about is let's build a coalition between children, young people and the adults and go, what is the problem that we need to solve here? What is the actual problem? And then think about segmenting children, for example, by age. So could we introduce legislation or policy or a conversation about when is it ever socially acceptable that a 2-year-old has their own device? What does that do to the time and the connection that they should have with play and their parents? Do we want our next generation of children to be actively online more than they're outside playing? Or, what kind of childhood do we want to build for our children? And how do we put some specific measures in place that give parents the type of the type of support that they need to have those conversations with children. So, for example, if we say no child under the age of 8 should have access to a personal device that's wired up for social media, would parents support that? How would they cope with it? How would we help them enforce it? Whereas with 14-year-olds who already spend a lot of their time online, we know that when we try and talk to parents about how they might limit that, they talk about getting into real conflict with their children and young people, and it then becomes a barrier to good relationships because young people just stop talking about it. Parents then don't ask enough of the right questions. So you do have children being harmed online but not feeling able to discuss it. So you've got to go quite careful with this. But for us, the thing that's missing is an honest and brave conversation about what is the problem that we need to solve and what actions can we take now that protect children in the long term.
There are probably many people watching and many people out there who can't get their child off a phone and can't get their child out of their bedroom because they're on devices. I mean, is there any guidance or any advice you can give for individuals in that situation? Because it is really hard, because it's presumably, it is quite addictive, isn't it?
It's so hard. It's actually so hard it breaks your heart. I'm a parent and I look at my own, now 20-year-old, and you can see that the impact that having a phone in your hand has all the time. And parents want the best for their children. Most parents want the best for their children. They don't intend to cause them hurt or harm. But if you think about how we're all addicted to these phones, I think the most important thing that we can do is name that, model good behaviour ourselves, first of all, talk to our children about, that we understand how addictive it is and how hard it is to make decisions to put the phone away and do something else. But I think we need to have those conversations as early as possible. I think when parents, one of the things I always think about is whenever you decide to give your child that device, please do that in the full knowledge that your child will come across content, despite your best efforts, that will cause them harm. So do it with the full knowledge of that and take all the steps that you can to mitigate it.
Yeah.
If you're not able to say absolutely no, and you intend, for whatever reason, your decision is to give your child the phone, be clear that there will be some consequences of that. Talk to the child about that early and do all the mitigations and all the protections that you can. There's great advice about, controls and all the rest of it. What we know, though, is for the most part, people can get around those and children can access information that's harmful. So keep conversations going, set simple rules and stick to them. No phones in bedrooms, no phones at the table, protect some family time. If you can, and this is really difficult for some of the families that we support because of poverty, if you can, and you do have the resources, identify the things that your child is good at or loves doing away from phones, hobbies, being outside, go outside for walks as a family, all of the things that you can think about in terms of your own childhood, actually, and what you enjoyed, your children will enjoy too. But it's for me, everything is about communication and relationships, and remembering that your connection to your child takes a lot of work. And what we hear really sadly from a lot of parents that contact us through our services and our support line is that they feel their child is more connected to their digital device than they are to their family, and that can become really, really dangerous for children.
Yes. Yeah. Well, yes, I have children myself, and I absolutely understand it, and I'm sure people watching too. But moving away from the digital world, you've described poverty as the major cruelty facing children. So, can you describe a little bit what that looks like in communities or in with those people that you've worked with or work with?
And it can vary, and vary in severity from family to family and circumstances to circumstance. But I would say it's always been a factor in supporting families financially in our work. But primarily for a long time, we were making progress on child poverty, in particular in Scotland. Good progressive policies and action to invest in supports, early supports and prevention that would tackle that, whether that was through giving families the financial support they needed, or the caregivers and parents the employability support or learning support that they needed. I would say post-COVID, I mean, a bit before that, but post-COVID, what really shocks me as somebody, and you mentioned that I've been working in this field for over 30 years. When I was a social worker 30 years ago in some really disadvantaged communities in Glasgow, there was poverty. There was inevitably children who lived in dire poverty, and we were able to do something about that. The sheer numbers now and the level of material poverty and long-term enduring poverty that we see is like nothing really that I've seen before. So how that manifests itself is we are visiting families where parents are not eating at all, skipping lunches, maybe having a piece of toast in order to be able to give their children something to eat. And even then, the quality of what they're giving their children wouldn't be what you would view as a healthy meal, just because they're financially so constrained. We get a lot of telephone calls or contact to our national support line where people will say, I have absolutely no money. This is actually a true story. I have no money, and I have 4 children about to come home from school and no dinner to be able to provide them. So it's real hardcore material poverty where benefits do not allow families to cope with the increasing cost of living. The cost of food is huge just now, and the benefits or supports or wages, because many of the families that we support are poor but working, some of the benefits that they get that they've just not kept up with the rate of inflation. So families are expected to manage all of that on the same amount of money that they had, 4 or 5 years ago. So it manifests itself in a way where children go to school hungry, unable to learn, or sometimes miss school. They don't have the basics that they need. We're coming into winter. We know that a lot of our work needs to be about trying to make sure children have warm coats and shoes and boots to wear to school, to make sure that children have enough to eat. The other thing is that because families are so desperate, they get caught up in terrible spiraling debt, which is really difficult to manage. And they also just feel totally overlooked in the conversation, where there is this kind of expectation that nobody really cares about it, and that there's a level of tolerance for chronic poverty that's long-term and enduring, and that nobody cares. Now, we know we can make a difference in that in Scotland, and we are probably doing better than elsewhere in the UK just now, but there are political choices that need to be made to just practically give people more money and then give them more support to be able to overcome some of the challenges that keep them, the furthest away from education, learning, or work, because that's what really will tackle poverty. But we just need to be much more progressive in our understanding and the harms that it does now and the cost that we'll all pay for that in the future.
Yeah, food and energy bills also, aren't they, as you've mentioned?
Absolutely. Yeah, we spend a lot of our time giving emergency payments to families who are about to have their heating cut off because they can't afford to pay the bill, or they're in debt, and some of that debt's public. We've had other colleagues and other charities tackle some of that public debt to give families a fair chance. It just comes at them, all over the place. And for our kids, they can't afford to go to have hobbies. They don't have birthday cakes and parties. Coming up to Christmas is just an intolerable pressure. And one of the things that when I talk about childhood being robbed, is the families and children that we support. They're not expecting Santa Claus coming down the chimney with a wonderful Christmas. To them, they know that times are tight and they don't want to put that pressure on their parents. So we have children that never ask for anything for birthdays or Christmas because they can see the stress and the strain that puts on their parents. It's heartbreaking.
Yes. And I'm wondering if it affects their sort of sense of security and trust and development.
And I think all of it, affects their health, it affects their physical and emotional development. We have a huge problem in our country about the level of anxiety that children carry. So when we did a consultation over the summer with children, they talked about being worried about the winter, being worried about being cold, being scared of being hungry. They talked about worrying about their parents because they understood that they worried about that too. So there was this inevitable cycle of children just carrying this level of fear, which impacts their development, their health, their physical health, but really crucially, their mental health. We should not have children in our country, in a country as wealthy as ours, who are carrying anxiety about whether or not they're going to be able to have a dinner when they go home from school, or who carry the shame of poverty. That shame does something to the way their brains and their bodies develop. It's all interconnected. They don't go to school ready to learn. They go to school hungry and worried about what's happening at home and what's going to happen when they get there after school. So they fall behind educationally, and the truth is they don't grow as fast. They don't develop as well. They don't have the same opportunities. And this inequality gap between those of us who have and those of us who don't just gets wider, which is really bad for the country in all sorts of ways, our economic prosperity, but just in terms of what we believe is the right thing to do for our families and our communities.
Are there times when poverty is mistaken for neglect, and what can families or communities do to try and look out for this?
I think that's a really good point, actually. And I think we have done a lot. In fact, I know we've done a lot on challenging this notion that there was no link between neglect and poverty, and holding families accountable. And sometimes in our child protection systems, and I remember this in my days as a social worker, we would sometimes hold families who were living in chronic poverty to standards that they were unable to meet just because they didn't have enough money. And then we were almost blaming them for the impact that had on their children. So I think that we've made a lot of progress there. I think we're much more understanding within the child protection systems, and we're much more compassionate. Inevitably, there is still, for some children, a link between neglect and what happens at home, and poverty plays a part in that. So for parents who are chronically stressed because of poverty, and carry potentially, and we know this a lot from our work, historic trauma from their own childhood experiences, there are lots of links between poverty and trauma. There are lots of links between poverty, trauma, drug and alcohol use in order to kind of numb some of the feelings that that inevitably causes. And so there are children that can be neglected in those circumstances. And we do need to intervene with both support, but also to make sure that those children are safe and well. So it's quite a complicated picture. I think we've got better at understanding the links. My fear is that we see children in poverty, and we talk about it so much now, especially when we talk about statistics, that we've almost lost our sense of urgency about it. I get a bit worried that we don't, as a country, feel as fired up and angry about this as we should, because poverty is something that we can do something about. We can make different political choices about where we invest our money. We can have a national conversation as a country about whether or not we would prioritise children's needs and rights to have enough of a basic life to be safe over some of the other ways that we spend our money. And I'm a child rights campaigner, always have been. Of course, I would say this. But what I want the rest of the country to know is this is going to have implications for all of us, for our future prosperity, for our well-being as a country, and for who looks after us when we're older. But children have a right to a good life now. And so I think we really need a big national conversation about priorities. Now, I wish it was more prevalent in the political discourse that there is currently. But if you look at the news and you listen to what people say they're exercised about, it's small stuff, really. It's small scale stuff. It's not the big stuff that will have implication, which is children's safety, well-being, and ability to thrive and be healthy.
Do you think children don't really have a political voice? I mean, they
I
were
don't
locked
think
out,
so.
weren't they? And no one asked them if that was going to affect them for generations, and it seems to have done a lot of harm to many. Do you think that's an issue right now?
I think we sometimes, with the best of intentions or the information that we've got at the time, we do make quick decisions. It's interesting, isn't it? The pandemic's a really good example of where the evidence is incontrovertible that for whatever the intent, the children, being locked down away from school has caused significant long-term harm to their educational attainment, to their relationships, their developments, and specifically to their mental health and well-being. But when you listen to the discourse around children's behaviour and children's, children who are not at school, not able to attend school, it's not very compassionate always. I think we've forgotten about what happened to children. It was not of their doing. They were very compliant. When the children and young people that we worked with through the pandemic, who were having opportunities to play taken from them, to learn, to be with their friends, they were so compliant and well behaved. They were so compassionate and concerned about their community members, their grandparents, their relatives who were vulnerable, that they did what they were told. And the consequences of that for them have been really significant. And yet, I think we've moved back to a place where we talk about children, young people in a way that's really harsh in this country again. We've forgotten about child development. We've forgotten about the impact of the pandemic. And we're back to talking about children needed to be excluded from school because their behaviour is so bad. Well, what did we think was going to happen? And what do we think is going to happen when we let our children see extreme violent and pornographic content online, keep them away from schools, shut down youth centres, don't allow them to play outside, or we complain to the police if they kick a ball around. And we don't want to see them out in our communities. And then we blame them and we shame them for their behaviour. And for me, I think it's because we've forgotten the core details about child development. 2-year-olds have tantrums. We should not be shaming parents in supermarkets or cafes, and parents shouldn't feel they have to give their children digital devices so that they don't scream or shout out or play. Teenagers test boundaries and go outside and take risks. It is a core part of what it means to be human, what it means to develop. And if we've robbed children of that, that's going to have consequences for us. And then, of course, what we do is blame them, or we label them, or we give them a child and adolescent mental health diagnosis that probably they don't always need. What they need
Yeah.
is spaces and places that they can share their voice and be heard compassionately.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's something over 100,000 children who are either in the UK missing from school either permanently or are not going to school full time. But I'm just wondering whether you think that, how parents and carers can um, mitigate the effects of that period on child development and mental health, and how they can help encourage children who aren't going to school back into school, the whole picture of it. What do you think are the best? And you've mentioned giving them spaces to sort of develop and be children, but are there any other things that we should be doing in terms of their development now?
It's so hard. I mean, if you asked me, in terms of investments, I think we should support parents and carers, those that are able and those that want to spend more time with their children, with more support, with more resources, to be less worried about poverty and anxious about their own mental health. So I think one of the core things we need is, if we think about some of the best policy decisions with the best outcomes for children, it was probably that period when we were investing heavily in children in their earliest years. So I think we need a national rollout of really good, high quality support to parents and caregivers pre-birth and in the earliest years, and that it should be an absolute acknowledged given that we all need help to raise babies and children. It's never been harder, and that we need a core level of financial, emotional, and practical support to make sure that that happens. So, in family centres and in nurseries and community centres, places and spaces where people can come together and build a sense of community. It's really isolating to be a parent just now. And so that's why people turn to their devices. It's why people turn to the communities that they have online. And whilst there is absolutely a place for that, and there's a lot of support to be found there, in my view, you get better quality connection, better quality support if you're alongside other parents and their children, and building networks and sense of connection and community where children truly are brought up in a way that it says, it takes a village to raise a child. So I think we need to think about investment in the early years and those types of resources. And for children, older children and young people, we need to think about what their alternatives are to being online and at home. So parents often talk about it's risky to have your child outside. They think the danger exists oftentimes in their communities and parks or in spaces, when the reality is most children currently are harmed online. We need to remind parents the internet is a place where your child goes. And actually, what we need to reclaim are healthy outdoor spaces for children and a tolerance that children have a right to play. We should see children in our communities. We should see them in our parks. We should see them in our streets. They should have a right to be visible, and we should cherish and welcome that. We need to rethink the whole notion about where children should be. We've kind of moved back to that Victorian notion that children should be, maybe seen, probably not most of the time, but definitely not heard. We've got to change that. And one of the things we always talk about at Children First is this gap between what Scotland says and what Scotland does. So we have brilliant policy. We have fantastic legislation. We've incorporated UNCRC. We talk about Scotland being the best place in the world to grow up. We've progressively passed legislation to mean that children cannot be physically punished, smacked, hit by their parents. And yet, children's everyday experience seems to be getting worse. And I think it's about how we view childhood and children. It's just that we've lost our focus. So I think there's a bit about what we can do as a society. We can make demands on the politicians that we vote for, but we can also in our everyday lives be kinder and more compassionate to children when we see them. We can, one of the things that I find really interesting is when people talk about being scared of teenagers. We're all a bit anxious if we see groups of teenagers. Our experience, I cannot say this strongly enough, is our experience is that the young people that we support are the most compassionate, well-informed, tolerant generation I think we've ever had in our country. They are kind to each other, they are supportive, and yet we almost demonize them. We need to bring teenagers and young people back into our communities and value their voices, value their skills, and make sure that they feel they're a core part of it rather than push them aside as these problems that we need to manage. It's simply not true, and it's so unfair.
Yeah, there's been some talk about, how children aren't out on the streets if they're feeling, disenfranchised or they haven't got enough money or whatever, but they are it's called sedation, isn't it? They just switch off and check out and sit on their phones. It's about, the idea of, but how would individual families and carers and foster carers try and reverse that and try and help children? I mean, you can't just say, well, go outside and play because no one else is out there.
No. Yeah. I do think it's about family rules and norms and the way we do things in our family conversations. So one of the simple things that, oftentimes you hear that teenagers need to be with other teenagers. So adults can start to withdraw a bit, and we can normalize this idea that actually they don't want to be with their parents or their wider family members. They just want to be with their friends. Our experience and the feedback that we get from children is that is not true. They actually crave connection to their parents. Sometimes their developmental stage means that shows up in slightly uncomfortable, awkward, or even ways that feel like you're being pushed away. But actually, the children, young people that we've spoken to that tell us consistently they want to spend time with their parents. And developmentally, some of the research suggests is that the worst thing that we can do at that stage of adolescent development is put teenagers together when all their brains are developing at crazy rates and are, all over the place with hormones. Actually, what we need to do is balance that out with really good quality conversations and shared times with families. So again, coming back to let's always eat round the table where that's possible. Let's make sure that at least a couple of evenings a week we come together as a family to do something, even if it is watch the TV and watch a movie, but we agree that for a couple hours we'll put our phones away. Let's, if we've got a dog, make sure that we each try and get time taking the dog for a walk together and having conversations. We know, for example, that those sort of side-by-side conversations work really well with adolescents. I don't know what your experience was, but when my son was a teenager, long drives in the car, listening to some music, but having conversations where you heard everything that was going on, or, getting up late, whereas actually looking at them directly is a little bit uncomfortable and eye contact can become a wee bit awkward. But those... And also, one of the things I think we sometimes forget is show interest in what they're interested in. So, what music do they like? What is it they see online? What are they looking at? What influencers do they follow? Why does that matter to them? What are they interested in? What do they think about? So, one of the things that I think, I know it's really good for relationships is curiosity. And I do think we all, and I include myself in this, we fall into traps of communication, particularly with early teens and mid-teens, where we start asking them what they've done and telling them what they've got to do. You just get into that pattern, don't you? Tidy your room. Who did you see? Who were you out with? And I think remembering those open questions that we're better at with little toddlers, tell me about what's happening. Show me, show me more, tell me more. Those types of prompting conversations where you really give them time. The single biggest thing I think that makes a difference is time invested in those relationships with your children. And I get that's tough, particularly these days. But I think we all have to think about our own time online. What is it stealing from us as well as what it's stealing from our children? So put the Instagram off a couple of nights a week and just go talk to your kids in as simple a way as you possibly can.
I mean, you've said that children are bombarded with images of lives that are unobtainable and what they're into, and trying to talk to them about what they're into may be, I don't know, Love Island or the Kardashians, nothing wrong with that, but it may not be what you want them to necessarily prioritize in their lives. So how do you navigate that?
Yeah. But I think the way, it's interesting because I've been thinking about this recently. I think the way into a good conversation around that is to meet the child with curiosity and interest about why they like that particular influencer or that particular YouTube channel or that content. What is it about? Like, seek to understand, not judge stuff. So what is it you like about them? What do you think's going on for them? Why do you think they do and say that? And then once you've kind of established that you're just curious, you're not judging, you're not being judgmental, you're just interested, I think it becomes a little bit easier to say, I wonder if though, or do you think, or what does that make you feel like when you see somebody who has spent all that money on looking really, as far from them true self as possible? How does that make you feel about how you look? And helping. I mean, I think children are pretty good at making judgments, and they know for the most part some of that stuff. But a lot of children and young people do take it on, and it causes a lot of difficulty. So I think you can open up the conversation through curiosity and not being judgmental, but be interested, and then maybe try and shape the conversation towards, what does that mean for you, with a lot of reassurance that, you love that child for who they are, how they look, and that they're good enough. So just trying to get little opportunities, I think, to give those nice messages. I think we're all subject to it. It's incredibly hard, but I know the worst mistakes I've made are when I've maybe said, oh, that influencer or that thing is just a lot of rubbish, and you're rotting your brain because you're looking too much at YouTube. That's a conversation closer. It's not an opener. So you've got to retrain yourself, haven't you, to go out. How I want to talk about this thing. What's the best way to approach this with a young person who's probably at a developmental stage that means that they're a wee bit wired for defensiveness? You need to go really gently with them. You need to be really patient. And I think the biggest single thing I've learned, and I think my colleagues in Children First would tell us, you need time and space invested in the relationship so that
Do you
you
think,
really get to know the child.
yeah, do you think that sort of pressure of influencers and following unobtainable images are heavier for children in care or very low income families, or not?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think all children have this difficulty, but I worry particularly about those children who don't have any alternatives, who live in families where relationships are fractured, where there are additional difficulties, so relationships are not good, or they live in households where there is domestic violence, drug or alcohol use, mental health problems. Childhood becomes very lonely for those children. Stigma and shame means they withdraw sometimes from school and other friendship groups. Poverty means they don't get access always to hobbies or an ability to go out because they don't feel that they can fit in, all of which pushes them into this world. And if you add AI into the mix of that now, I think it can become quite a dangerous set of circumstances for children with additional vulnerability, children who are neurodivergent, children who are, marginalised through disability or other issues that affect their inclusivity. I think we've got to look out for those children and be particularly concerned about how loneliness and isolation can push them into relationships and spaces online which can exploit them. I think that creates the conditions for that sort of exploitation, definitely.
I know that Children First aims to help before crisis hits. So, what does that sort of early intervention look like?
Yeah. One of the things we do is think that, our absolute purpose is to prevent harm before it happens. And we get really frustrated, along with lots of people, that, again, in Scotland, we talk very well about prevention. We know all that we need to know. We know if we support babies and children and families in their early years, then that'll have better outcomes for their health, education. We'll have less problems, down the line. We know all of it. We are notoriously bad at implementing policies that take account of that. So we spend all our money and all our time in the crisis end, Whereas what we want to do, so we do two things at Children First, I guess I should say. We campaign to constantly talk about the need for prevention. Get in early, stop terrible things happening, tackle poverty, make sure children and families are strong, that relationships are supported, and that we have parents and caregivers who are supported to overcome their own challenges to be there for their own children. So we campaign, legislation, policy, talk to politicians, raise our own campaigns around that. And the other thing that we do is we make a specific commitment that all of our children's services are about keeping children in their own families and communities. So we don't have residential care, and we don't have foster carers, because we believe that all of our efforts should go into keeping children within their own families, extended families, or communities, where of course it's safe to do so. But we expect the state, and we ask and demand that the state puts in all its resources to make sure that happens. Of course, some children will need to be removed to be safe, but we believe we take far too many children away from their own families because we don't put the help in early enough and the resources in at the right end. We wait till things get past crisis point, and then we have to intervene in a very punitive way. Children are removed, and then it's really hard to get them home again. So all of our services are focused on initiatives, projects, programs, services that strengthen family relationships, because one of the things we talk about is knowing that children's safety and well-being is protected, it's compromised sometimes, and it's recovered within the context of their own families. That's the best chance we've got. If we can build strong, safe families for children and keep them there, it saves so much in human cost to children and communities, but also in economic cost to a care system that, quite frankly, fails the majority of children and costs an awful lot economically.
I mean, we do hear shocking examples of children who are failed because of abuse at home or neglect, severe neglect at home, and things really go wrong. And it may be that families are not actually just asking for help, but they do, they need sort of intervention early. But why do you think some families delay getting help when they need it?
I think sometimes there's a shame and stigma around asking for help. I think there are some families where there's intergenerational trauma, which impacts on how whether people have the right skills and knowledge, resources, supports to be able to safely care for children. I think the system sometimes misses those families because we deem them to be too hard to reach, difficult to engage. All sorts of language is used around those families. I think we have a tolerance, particularly in certain communities where there is poverty and disadvantage and cyclical difficulties that have gone on over time. We've got a tolerance for those families over there. So I think we've also built a child protection system over many years based on what's gone wrong and who's been blamed for it. So we really have a system, I think, that protects our systems from being blamed for what might go wrong, which means that sometimes we step away from some of those families because we think if we touch that and then something goes wrong, we're going to be held responsible for it. Whereas if we don't see it and something goes wrong and there's a big drama about it, we can say, well, we didn't know that family. So I think what we need, if I'm honest, is a massive, radical overhaul of our child protection system. I think we need to be prepared to stand up and face up to the fact that some children are harmed and some children do need support much earlier. And we usually know who those children are. We know we can identify many of those families in our communities, and we need to make sure, again, it comes back, I think, to spaces where people come together, communities where people recognise those children, care for those children, and don't have a tolerance for things not being right, and do it in a way that's early enough to offer support, rather than those specific interventions that involve punitive child protection processes and children are removed. Most times that happens, not always, but a lot of the time that happens because we're just not offered the support early enough. And we've probably had people who've been worried about that child, but just nervous and scared about intervening. So again, it's just that sense of community that we need to build, where every child is everybody's responsibility, and what happens to them, we all need to take responsibility for.
Can you think of any examples, obviously without identifying any families or children, where early intervention made uh, the difference? And
So many. I mean, it works so well. And it's one of my, you know, one of my huge frustrations in my career is, so as far back as look, 25, 26 years ago, the reason I left social work, actually, I left formal statutory kind of child protection and social work, was because I just felt really sad about the fact that by the time we were supporting children or families through quite invasive child protection processes, you knew that there had been missed opportunities to tackle that and keep that child safe within their own family or wider family network. So one of the things I did then 25 years ago was left social work, and I worked in a community, it was Easter House in Glasgow, and set up a multi-agency nursery and family centre. And its specific goal was to say, if we can, the reason we chose that area was because it was an area of Glasgow that had the highest number of children being removed from their own families because of risks and concerns. Um, and in fact, I think the council at that point had asked the charity that I worked for then to build a children's home. And I was saying, I don't think you should build a children's home. Why don't you build a family resource centre that supports parents and carers to keep their children safe? And so I managed, developed, designed with the community and built this purpose-built family centre and nursery. And what that meant was it was a non-stigmatised way in for families to place their babies in a nursery. And whilst they were doing that, we had really warm, and we worked so hard. It's a bit like what we do in Children First now, worked really hard to create such a warm, non-judgmental environment so that you could say to the parent after they dropped their child off, why don't you come and have a cup of coffee and let's have a chat? And in that chat, you then end up being quite curious about what else is going on. Is there anything we can do? Because maybe we've noticed that the babies come in to nursery and they're maybe not as clean as they should be, or the nappy's not been changed, or they look a bit underweight, or they seem a bit anxious. It's, you can catch people in a more informal way. Is everything okay for you? Do you need a bit of support? And one of the things we found to be most effective was building a warm relationship with the caregiver, offering practical support first. So, do you need help with your housing? Can we give you some financial advice that helps you manage that debt? Do you need support to go along to the benefits agency? Would you like to try that college course? Shall I come with you and help you think about it? Any number of practical supports are a really good gateway into getting into some of the emotional challenges and the traumas that people carry that are really at the heart of the matter, that are really the reason that they're struggling. And then we had a whole heap of women's groups, dads groups, specific and individual therapeutic relationships with skilled staff who talked about drug and alcohol use, money advice. We had a fruit and veg co-op. We had health visitors who would come to the centre and offer advice on nutrition. We had health and wellbeing practitioners who would offer therapeutic massage. So basically, my answer to this is that we build these multi-agency, multidisciplinary spaces where the needs of children are at the centre, but we recognise that the needs of those children are best met by strong family members and caregivers who are well supported, connected, and cared for too. So sometimes we would talk about nurturing the parents, because they love these children, they love these babies. The reason they were struggling with it was oftentimes their own experience of child abuse or neglect in their past histories. They'd not been parented or cared for appropriately themselves. So we're building and modelling all the time warmth, unconditional regard, kindness, positivity, and we're also modelling how to be the whole time. And that, for me, was the best example of a preventative service. And we, over time, the evidence was incontrovertible. We stopped babies where there were a lot of worries and concerns from being removed into care, and they stayed with their own families and they were safe. And even if they didn't stay with their own parents, they maybe went to their granny or their auntie, and we supported them to keep them within that family network so their identity in that family was protected and they were looked after well.
Yeah, you said relationships are the foundation of change. What makes a relationship healing for a child who has experienced trauma or neglect or poverty?
So across our services across Scotland, we do a lot of trauma recovery services for children who've experienced abuse and neglect. And in fact, all of our family support services have that element. We talk about being trauma responsive and sensitive. And effectively, this is skilled, it's complex, it's, it's difficult work, but actually it's pretty simple. So it's not easy, but it is pretty simple. An effective family support or therapeutic recovery work is centred on the relationship, and it's where that relationship has time is given, is recognised that the therapeutic intervention is the amount of time and listening that you put in. It's a much underrated therapeutic tool, time and listening. So it's the one thing that our services, our formal services, our health services, for example, have taken out. We have 10 minutes to go to your GP and talk about the fact that you feel suicidal. That's not really going to work out, is it? So one of the things that we really fight for in our services is to protect time to get to know the child, to get to know their story, to get to know their interests, to listen carefully to what it is that they want to say, and to not think that there is some programmed approach that will fix that child. It doesn't exist. And so for some children, it might take a matter of weeks. For some children, it might take a matter of months. For some children and families, it can take years. And that can be because of the level of complexity that they've dealt with. So time, care, concern, no judgment, no shame, no stigma, and really getting alongside that child to recognise and not assume what they feel has happened to them and what they think better might look like. And I guess as well, one of the things that our colleagues do really effectively, and I know this because children tell me that, is they let children know they were not to blame because they were children. And also that whatever's happened to them will not define them, does not need to define them from the rest of their lives, that they will recover and that they will go on and lead successful, happy lives. So recovery is possible is a really strong message, that we don't, maintain children in a victim's kind of status. We make sure that we talk with them in a way that gives them a strong, powerful, positive message of hope.
And so, sort of finally, looking ahead, what kind of Scotland would you like today's children to inherit? What does it look like?
One that puts children first, and it's a bit of a cliche. It's why I love working for Children First, because I think it's the best name for a children's charity there is. But what I mean by that is that we absolutely, as a country, look at our policy, our legislation, and the way we invest and spend our money around the needs of children. And that might sound really radical, because you'll have people saying, but what about older people? What about disabled people? What I would say is, if we build, and I believe this absolutely passionately, if we build a country that takes account of children's rights and needs and builds it to that end, it will be right for everybody. Get a country right for children, it will be right for everybody. Be right for older people, it will be right for disabled people, because what it will do is recognise that you need to look after our most precious citizens in all the spaces and places that they go. We need to welcome them, we need to make them feel important, and then that will just naturally flow through the way that we are with each other. So I would love to think that we put into practice, because we know enough now. We don't need to do any more research. We know what causes harm. We know what builds strong, healthy relationships. We know what children need to develop into safe, happy, healthy adults. What we need to do is put everything into making that happen and close the gap between what Scotland says about children and what we actually do about them. So I want us all to think about, Every time you see a child, every time you see a teenager, smile at them, speak with them, show interest in them, show care toward them. And let's not be frightened of our children. Let's make them feel really welcome and at the centre of our communities and our country.
Absolutely. Very inspirational. Mary, thank you so much for sharing your insights and showing how early help and trust and community can transform children's lives. If you'd like to hear more conversations like this, subscribe to Family Talk from Care Visions, where we explore how carers, families, and communities can help Scotland's children thrive. I'm Lucy Johnston. Thank you so much for listening.